Welcome, everybody, to the NFL Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for the NFL Show, Mike Goodpaster. And right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
Doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me on today.
And Anthony could not be with us today, so hopefully he'll be back tomorrow. Everything's fine there. Today, we're going to talk about the top 10 running backs in NFL history. And Sam, let's start with your number 10.
All right, so at number 10, I'm going to start off. I got Marshall Faulk at number 10. It's a very unconventional player sort of at the running back position because of how much he did in the receiving game, and really was one of the pioneer dual threat running backs, I guess you could say, of the modern era. Certainly there's been others throughout history, but Faulk, you look at him, one of the only three running backs in history to have 1,000 rushing yards and 1,000 receiving yards in a single season. And really his threat didn't come from him necessarily on the ground, but his ability to do both of them. And he led the league in yards from scrimmage twice and won Offensive Player of the Year 3 times and an MVP award.
All right, I've actually got Falk much higher, so I'll talk about him later on. Number 10 for me is Emmitt Smith, which I know if Anthony was here, he'd be raising hell. But 3-time Super Bowl champion, 1-time Super Bowl MVP, voted at a Pro Bowl 8 times, first team All-Pro 4 times, NFL career leader in rushing yards, 18,355. Touchdowns, leader, career, 164. Led league in rushing 4 times, rushing touchdowns 4 times, and elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I think this. A lot of people will say that he is overrated because of the offensive line. I don't think that. I think he's one of the greatest running backs of all time, and if you think it's too low, that's fine. But as I go through this, I just think there was 9 guys that were better. But I think you could really see the significance of him for that team in Dallas the second year of their back-to-back titles, where he sits out the first 2 games. They lose to Buffalo. They start the season 0-2. He comes back, and I think they lose 1 or 2 games the rest of the season. So I think he was a big part of why that Dallas Cowboy team was so successful.
Oh, for sure. They loved running the ball. I mean, that's why people always go after Troy Aikman because of his stats. But Troy Aikman was a great player. It's just that they loved running the ball with Emmitt Smith. And that was really kind of what helped them win games. So for Emmitt Smith, that's why they produced such great numbers. And they had offensive line as well. So it was a very dominant force during that time period.
All right, my number 9, LaDainian Tomlinson, 1-time NFL MVP. There's not a lot of running backs that have been the MVP of the league. Voted to the Pro Bowl 5 times. He led the league in rushing twice. Rushing touchdowns 3 times, holds the NFL record for most rushing touchdowns in a season with 28, 13,684 career rushing yards, 145 touchdowns, 17 career receiving touchdowns. And basically this to me came down between him and Adrian Peterson. And I just think Tomlinson affected the game more in more different ways than what AP did. But I think LaDainian Tomlinson, especially over the last 15 years, it's hard to find a better running back.
Well, yeah, he even threw passes. He did everything. Like, he was really the running back who could do everything. It was just surprising that he was capable of doing all that stuff, especially we haven't seen a running back really do that since then. We haven't seen a guy like him at all, really. And it's been surprising for me because I grew up watching LT play, and it's been surprising that there hasn't been another guy of his quality come through and play like him. I expected there to be more of them, but there haven't been. He really is a unique player in NFL history.
All right, so he's not in your top 10?
No, he's in my top 10. He's up there.
Number 9 for you.
Number 9, I have, and this is because of how short his prime was, not necessarily because of his play. I have Earl Campbell at 9 because he was dominant. He was probably the best running back in the NFL for maybe 4 seasons. 4 seasons in a row, from 78 to 81. I think by far the best running back during that time span. First team All-Pro 3 times, 1 MVP award. But injuries did get to him after that in the 1982 season. He only played 9 games. He bounced back in 83, had another 1,300-yard season, and then injuries did him in after that. So really only 5 prime years. But I think when you watch him play during that time period, he was so dominant during those 5 years. I think he qualifies as a top 10 running back of all time.
Actually, I've got Earl Campbell a little bit higher. And I know it was a short time. Terrell Davis is a guy that I really wanted to put on here also, but we'll talk about Campbell in a minute. My number 8 is Tony Dorsett, and we're actually going to try to run a little video here. I know that
You still there, Mike? You're frozen up for me on my screen. We're back.
We're back. I don't know what happened there. I guess we're not adding video. I guess that won't work. We're going to try it again just for the hell of it. So anybody listening in or watching, this is all new to us. So we're going to blame it on Anthony since he's not here. So we'll see if we can get this to work this time. Hopefully it will. It says it's working slowly here. So Tony Dorsett's probably not on your top 10 list, right?
No. That's why I feel really bad. There's honestly 12 or 13 running backs who I really think have arguments to be in the top 10. And Dorsett was one guy who's like, oh, I know he's really that good. I know he's that good, but I just couldn't fit him in.
Yeah, I think there's more than 12 or 13 when I look at it, because another guy that I wanted to put on it but I didn't was Gale Sayers. And that's a guy I think is one of the great running backs of all time. But once again, it was the shortened career, even more shortened than what Earl Campbell's was. A little bit longer than Terrell Davis. But is the picture showing anything right now, or are we just going to load, it looks like?
It's just loading for me. Now we're going. Video's playing now.
All right, because when you watch Dorsett, I mean, if you look at his feet, this dude could create things. And I think people forget that the Dallas Cowboys up until if you look at like 1975, 76, they lose Super Bowl 10. I think they lost in an NFC championship game. And Dorsett was the guy when he got there in 77. When he took over, that team went immediately and won the Super Bowl. Now, the video looks a little bit messed up, doesn't it?
A little grainy, yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to get out of it. That's how my life is, too. It's a little bit grainy since I'm older. But so who do you have at number 8?
This is where I have LaDainian Tomlinson. I have him at 8. And it's like, for all the reasons you said, he was really the do-it-all kind of back in the league. He won the MVP. He had those several dominant years. And even though, we've seen guys who've had dominant years in the past when they fall off steeply, he performed at a high level for 8 to 9 years in the NFL. He had 1,000 rushing yards. He was very good in the receiving game, too. So for him to be as good as he was, as consistently as he was, I think people overlook him sometimes in the production he had during his span in the NFL.
Well, I think the one big difference is always that would be just the fact that if they win the Super Bowl the year they go 14-2, and for some reason, they intercept a pass, the guy doesn't just go to the ground, he gets stripped of the ball. I mean, that could change everything. You put him in that Super Bowl and they win that Super Bowl. I think with him and Marty Schottenheimer and was it Phillip Rivers at the time? I mean, it changes everything for all three of those guys. Because right now, Schottenheimer goes down as a choke artist, which I think is unfair. And Rivers didn't win anything, at least so far. I don't think he's going to win anything where he's at. But my number 7, I'm going to go with Earl Campbell, NFL MVP. And I think that people forget how dominant he was with the Love You Blue Oilers. 1978, the first year he got there. 77, I think they went like 9-5. They were a good team, but they were stuck in the AFC Central with the Bengals and the Steelers. And the Bengals and Steelers were both good in 77. 78, the Bengals not so much, but the Browns were a good team. And then the Steelers were dominant. And they were a team that played bloodbaths against the Steelers. And the problem for Earl Campbell was his team just wasn't as good as Pittsburgh. And the offensive line was good, but the Pittsburgh defensive line was maybe the greatest ever. If it's not the greatest ever, it's up there. But Earl Campbell dominated. I think the one year, in 1980, he ran for like 1,800 yards. And not to rip on Dan Pastorini because he's been on the show. He's a friend of the shows. I really like Dan Pastorini. But if you switch the situation, Earl Campbell's rolling with Terry Bradshaw, we might put him as the best receiver, or best running back of all time, because he single-handedly carried that team all season because they were a team that ran the ball a lot more than what they passed it. And I think in the end, that's what shortened his career, just how much they ended up running the ball with him.
Yeah, through the first 4 years of his career, they ran the ball 1,400 times. So, they were using him easily over 300 times per year. And when you watch him play, you watch him running as the jersey get ripped off and all that kind of stuff, you see all these highlight plays of him just bang people over. And he was a challenge even for Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, like you said, had probably the greatest defensive front at the time in NFL history.
Yeah. And it was unbelievable the things he could do on a football field. All right, I'm going to go ahead and give you my number 6 because I think you already said Marshall Faulk, correct?
Yeah, I already said Faulk.
one-time NFL MVP, one-time should be two-time Super Bowl champion. And this still falls on Mike Martz to me, because if you watch Super Bowl 36, they lost that game because, Belichick coached a great game. Brady was clutch at the end of the game. But in the end, when Falk is only touching the ball 15 times in a game and you're losing in overtime, you just got to imagine if he's touching the ball 10 more times, which he should be, they win. And if you look at the year before, Dick Vermeil used him that way. But for his season, or for his career, over 12,000 rushing yards, over 100 career touchdowns, rushing touchdowns, 767 career receptions, 36 career rushing touchdowns. I mean, he was an unreal player. And I think the other thing people forget is he started off in Indianapolis, wasn't really happy there. But the year, I think it was 95, when they went to the championship game against your Pittsburgh Steelers, Marshall Faulk wasn't even on the field. And they claimed there was an injury, but everything I've heard since then says that maybe he just didn't want to be an Indianapolis Colt and was forcing the hand. And you got to think, if Marshall Faulk plays in that game, there's a good chance the Colts are in the Super Bowl against the Cowboys instead of the Steelers.
Well, yeah, because he's that good of a player. And we talked about how much he can affect the game in both the receiving and rushing attacks. And he was that good. And there hasn't been a modern equivalent of him, I think, in 2000 yet. I know Christian McCaffrey had a good year last year. He's probably the closest thing to Marshall Faulk in terms of what we have in the NFL right now.
Well, and the big thing there is I think he's a lot like Faulk, but can he do it for as long as Faulk did it? Who do you got at number 6?
At number 6, well, I think we skipped my number 7 real quick. But my number 7 is Adrian Peterson.
Well, that's why we skipped it. That's stupid.
I thought you wouldn't like that one. But
no,
yeah, I got Adrian.
Peterson to me, like I said, it was between him and Tomlinson for the more present guys.
Yeah, I put him over Tomlinson. And that's kind of a difficult situation because they are different style running backs. Tomlinson does a little bit of everything, and Adrian Peterson is more of a power back if you look at what he's done throughout his career. But he led the NFL in rushing yards per game 4 times, and total rushing yards 3 times, and rushing touchdowns twice. And of course, he's got that 2012 season where he comes back from the injuries, and he has over 2,000 rushing yards, nearly breaking Eric Dickerson's single season record. So for me, I've got him up at number 7.
All right, what's your 6?
6 is Eric Dickerson. I think to me, it was between him and Adrian Peterson. Was always difficult for me to distinguish which one, but I've got Dickerson ahead of him slightly. Obviously, he led the NFL in rushing yards 4 times. He led it in rushing yards per game 5 times, and he's the guy who holds the record right now for most rushing yards in a single season with 2,105 back in 1984.
I think you got him too low. My number 5 is Barry Sanders. And I think he has to be. He's in your top 5, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't sound too enthusiastic about that. But open field runner-wise, the only guy I've seen comparable to me is Gale Sayers. The issue was he wasn't really an every down back, if you know what I mean. He didn't catch a lot of passes out of the backfield. He couldn't really block. But just pure running, I mean, if I look at my list, if you're just talking about a pure runner, I mean, he's probably he's top 3 all time for me. So Barry Sanders is my number 5.
Wait, I remember watching highlights of him where he literally like turns defenders around and like they can't even find him. That's how he was with his movement with the ball and how fluid he was on the field. But
yeah, I'll tell you what, back when he was playing, Thanksgiving Day games with Barry Sanders playing were fine with everybody because he was going to put on a show one way or the other, whether his team was any good or not.
Yeah, you actually have something to watch the Lions do. You didn't have to watch them like they are now, where they just basically get out and get blown out pretty much every year.
Yeah. All right, you're number 4 or 5?
I think my number 5 still. But okay. My number 5, I have Emmitt Smith at number 5 overall. And like we talked about him earlier, MVP, 4-time first-team All-Pro. He leads the NFL all-time in career rushing yards. But I still have him down there because I think there were more impressive running backs. And I do think doing the top 10 running backs of all time is much more difficult for me than doing the top 10 safeties. I feel like there's a lot more qualified players for this position to be in the top 10.
Yeah, and with him, the game that stands out to me would be the 1993 last game of the season against I think it was the Giants, where he was beat up, he was injured, and he basically put the Cowboys on his back and won that game at the Meadowlands to win the division title. So to me, I could see anybody having him as high as number 5. I just think once you get up above this top 5, to me, these next four guys are unquestioned the four best running backs I've ever seen. So give me your number 4.
Yeah, my number 4 is O.J. Simpson. I think you're probably going to say he might belong in the top 3, but I still have him at 4. He's obviously a guy people, I think, overlook a lot now in the modern sense, actually because of what he's done off the field. But people forget that in 1973, he ran for over 2,000 yards in a 14-game season, which is just ridiculous considering what it took for some of the other guys to cross 2,000 yards in 16-game seasons. So for me, what he did is absolutely ridiculous during his time and during those 14-game seasons. And I think he's definitely one of the top 5 or top 4 running backs of all time.
Yeah, I've got my number 4 is Eric Dickerson. And to me, just pure runner. And the thing about Eric Dickerson was he pretty much ran straight up and down. And I mean, he just kind of ran away from people. And there was, to me, the best game I've ever seen him play was he ran for well over 200 yards in a 1985 divisional playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys, where they won the game 20-0. And he was the dominant factor in that entire game. And the problem with him was his team never was good enough to win a Super Bowl. They made it to the NFC Championship game in 85, where they got beat by the Monsters at a midway to Chicago Bears. So that hurts him. You had the, forcing the trade to Indianapolis. I think that hurts him. But the other thing to remember is first year of the Colts, they get him in 87. They go to the playoffs immediately. And they ended up losing to the Cleveland Browns in the playoffs. But I think you just see the impact he had just by going to a team. And if you look at the Rams, they were in the playoffs almost every year with him. He did have an issue with fumbling, which is why I've got him at 4 below the other 3 guys. But when you look at him, I mean, he had some monster playoff games. And I think in the end, his teams coming up short were more about his teams just not being good enough to get it done than anything else. I'll keep going here because my number 3 is O.J. Simpson. And just pure runner, there may not be any better than O.J. And the thing that blows my mind is doing research for this. I mean, like Gil Brandt has O.J. Simpson number 10. I mean, Gil Brandt knows a lot about football. How are you going to have him at number 10? And people forget OJ's first year or two with the Bills, they tried to make him a wide receiver. They screwed around with him. So you had a couple of years where he didn't really do anything, and the Bills were terrible. I mean, he was a one-time NFL MVP the year he ran for the 2,003 yards. And I think people forget this. The year he ran for over 2,000 yards, I'm pretty sure that the Buffalo Bills had a losing record, and he needed a couple hundred yards to go over 2,000 in that last game, and he did it at Shea Stadium in basically a muddy mess. I mean, it was just nothing but mud. He ran for 11,236 career yards, rushing yards. Led the league in rushing 4 times, rushing touchdown twice. His career was shortened because of a knee injury. He spent his last 2 years with the San Francisco 49ers in 78 and 79. So really you can make a case for the way his season started out, or career started out 69 and 70. He really only had 7 years of a prime, which is, I mean, really a lot for running backs, especially when you look at running backs back in the day that ran the ball so much. And really until you get to the mid-70s when Joe Ferguson arrives on the scene, he was the only threat. They had the Electric Company, one of the great offensive lines in history. He actually got into the playoffs once in 1974 where they lost to your Pittsburgh Steelers 32-14. But I think O.J. Simpson, as a football player, gets overlooked because O.J. Simpson, the man, probably doesn't rank in the top 10.
Well, yeah, he definitely loses out a little bit based on what he's done in the recent history since his football career ended.
So who do you have at your number 3?
I do have Barry Sanders at my number 3, just personally, because going back and watching him play, like I said, I haven't seen all of these guys in person, obviously, but going back and watching Barry Sanders play, it's something different. It's an experience for someone like me, because I don't think I've seen a guy quite like that in my lifetime because of just watching him play. I mean, it's ridiculous some of the things he did. Now, obviously, some of his runs, he was a big, I guess you could say, boomer bust running guy. He's a guy who might run for -2 yards one play and then run for 80 the next. But I just love watching what he can do. His fluidity, how his hips move, how his knees and ankles move when he was running with the ball. I feel it was really something special.
All right, number 2.
Number 2, and this is where it comes down to, I think you and I have the same 2 guys here. I have Walter Payton at number 2.
Yeah, we definitely have the same 2 guys, and I've got it in the same order you do, but I can tell you this. It's obvious our number 1 is Jim Brown, correct?
Yeah.
because you can disagree with Jim Brown being number one, but you're always going to have him in a top 10 list. But when I look at Peyton, and this is one thing where Walter Payton is one of my favorite players ever, especially didn't play on my team. I grew up watching Walter Payton, and Walter Payton was a guy that had an impact in the running game where he goes to the Bears, and the Bears had basically been crap since 1963 when they won the NFL championship 14-10 over Y.A. Tittle and the New York Giants. He gets there out of Jackson State, small black college, in 1975, 76. By 1977, they're winning the division. They're going to the playoffs. They get destroyed by the Cowboys, I think 37-7. 78, they don't make it. 79, they're back in the playoffs. They lose 27-17 to Philadelphia. And in 80, 81, 82, they're kind of like 500. The sad thing about him was when they get the great team in 1985, he's not what he once was because he's almost 10 years into his career, but he's still a great running back. And just imagine what that team would have been like with a prime Walter Payton. Now, he was still a bad dude. And the thing about Payton was he'd probably had more yards if he wasn't wanting to swerve back in the middle of the field so he could find somebody to run into, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about the fact that he was not maybe in his prime that 1985 season, but he was still rushing for 1,500 yards at that time. I think that really speaks to just how great of an athlete he was. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's 10 years into his NFL career who's still rushing for 1,500 yards. I mean, that's just how ridiculous he was. And if you watch him play, he's perhaps maybe the most complete superstar running back of all time because he could block, he could catch the ball out of the backfield, and you see him. He had the power, he had the quickness and the shiftiness. He had everything you want in a running back. Even he was a guy who could make Jim Brown impressed. I mean, he was really that kind of player.
Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing to watch him. He was the heart and soul of that team for years. And it's still my one big problem with Dick is giving the ball to that fat guy, number 72, instead of giving it to Walter Payton in the Super Bowl. But the one thing that does disappoint me is when you hear the story about him going in the closet and crying because he didn't get the ball at the end of the game or for that touchdown. And, you know, my thought is Walter Payton probably in 1982 never even thought he was going to sniff a Super Bowl. So quit bitching.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't expect people to do that. Like, you just don't expect people. I mean, even if you really wanted something like that, you should just win the Super Bowl. Be happy, like be excited. Like you never anticipated this coming to the NFL. Just be happy with it.
Yeah. All right. So number one, we both have Jim Brown, and I think the amazing thing about him was 12-game season. He ran for over 1,500 yards. I think it was in 1958. Which the previous record was Steve Van Buren in 1949 when he led the Eagles to the championship. And Van Buren that year, 1,146 yards. So the thing was, Brown was shattering records. And in that 1958 season, Sam, this was a guy in 12 games that scored 17 touchdowns. The next closest was Raymond Berry, a Colts wide receiver at 8.
Yeah, I mean, he dominated. And you talk about scoring 17 touchdowns in 1958. He scored 17 rushing touchdowns in 1965, his final season, too. So this is a guy who, even after 8 or 9 years when he's about ready to retire, he was still the best running back in football, and it wasn't even close. I mean, he had only 2 years out of his 9-year career where he didn't rush for over 100 yards per game. So he just, to me, he dominated the sport in some way that hasn't been dominated since. And maybe you say, oh, he played against lesser competition. But, that's kind of bull. I mean, like, you can only measure a guy by who he's playing against. And Jim Brown was a giant amongst men, and he just basically crushed everyone else. He was the best running back.
Well, the other thing is this. Since then, he is still the only running back to score score at least 4 touchdowns in 6 different games. Still an NFL record. The only guys to get close were LaDainian Tomlinson and Marshall Faulk, who both had 5 games with 4 touchdowns. He led the league in rushing a record 8 times. That's in 9 years. He was also the first NFL player to ever rush for 10,000 yards. So when you look at him, 1963, 12-game season, 1,863 yards. You give him one more game, he's going over 2,000, which makes it even quicker than what OJ did. He averaged 133 yards per game that season. And, I mean, when you look at him, there was 5.2 yards per carry. I mean, and when you look at it, there's very few times where you watch film on him where one guy tackles him.
No, I mean, he's just, like I said, he's dominant in this way. He's physically dominant in a way that we just weren't used to at that time in the sport. I mean, in that 1963 season, he averaged 6.4 yards per carry. I mean, those are numbers we see college football running backs put up And that's when they face teams like they face several good teams a year, but they also face some really bad teams every year too. That's why they get those high averages sometimes. Jim Brown's putting up college level numbers in the professional football league, and he's dominating everyone else. And it's just Jim Brown, and then there's a huge gap in everyone else to me.
Yeah, and the thing about Jim Brown, though, is everybody always talks about how everybody's bigger, stronger, and faster today than what they were back then. But, I mean, Jim Brown was 6'2", 230 pounds back in the day. So that's still a massive-ass running back to be able to run and play with that speed and agility.
Hey, he's still punched in the mouth today. I think if you put him in the modern football league, he'll still have success. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think a lot of people who try to take away from the early running backs in football or the early athletes in sports really are being short-sighted in saying that everyone's so much better today. I think that's short-sighted. I think Jim Brown is a guy who would have success in any era.
Well, put it like this. I think at quarterback, that is kind of a fair judgment if you go back to the 50s and 60s. But running back, I don't think it is. I think it's easier to be a running back now than it was back then. I mean, you got to remember back then an offensive lineman wasn't allowed to use his hands. He basically, you had the two flaps, you had to put them in front of people and basically try to block them that way. I mean, and how you going to block Deacon Jones by going like this? He just goes slap your elbow and go down by you. So when you look at it, I mean, he didn't catch the ball out of the backfield that much. He was a decent blocker. I think all around, I think Walter Payton might have been a better football player. But running the ball wise, when you watch his film, and yeah, it's basically like watching somebody that would be playing today, playing against a defense from 1950. So I think he's one of those guys that when you watch him, even his film from the 50s, he does translate to what's going on today.
Well,
just like I think when you watch Johnny Unitas play quarterback, Johnny Unitas could still play today.
Well, I think there's always a few generational talents who transcend the sport a little bit before their time even. So I think Jim Brown's one of those guys who really was playing with modern level athleticism and talent before the sport even caught up to that level.
Oh, and that's why he was so dominant. If you look at basketball, the best guy to compare there would be Wilt Chamberlain. I mean, he was 7'2", he could run the court, and he dominated much smaller guys. But if you drop Wilt Chamberlain in the NBA today, he's still going to be one of the best players.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, the best comparison for Wilt Chamberlain probably be someone like, even though the builds are different, someone like Shaq almost in the way they dominated the game, basically take over games single-handedly. That's why I would compare it to. I think because of his athleticism, I think Wilt would be even better in the modern NBA than Shaq was.
Well, he would be better because of this. The NBA center really started dying out in the early 90s. So now if you put a guy like Wilt there and you can throw the ball to him in the post, I mean, they can run a zone to slack off of him now, but the way people shoot the three, you can't really afford to do that. And how many guys in today's NBA could guard a guy like Wilt Chamberlain who's, 7'2", 275 pounds and can move?
Yeah, I mean, there's not many. I really think the best defensive centers even now are probably very weak compared to the guys who were playing in the 80s and 90s, or even before that. I think the best defensive centers, like someone like Joel Embiid or even like Anthony Davis at power forward, they're not going to match up against Wilt Chamberlain. It just won't happen.
No, they're not going to win a matchup against a guy like Hakeem Olajuwon.
No, they wouldn't. Hakeem was much better than both those guys. It's not even close.
The problem is if you put Hakeem in today's game, he's probably a three-point threat. Because he can shoot the ball from 20 feet away from the basket.
Hakeem was incredibly versatile in a way that I think was even more so than someone like Shaq or someone like Wilt, because Hakeem had the moves as well. He had some handles. He had the footwork, which was incredible, which translates not just to being around the basket, but also if you want to be out in the perimeter a little bit, having that footwork always helps you out. So I think someone like Hakeem is probably the most versatile center of that superstar class.
Well, I think Hakeem Olajuwon was the greatest center I ever saw.
Well, I didn't see Hakeem Olajuwon in person, so I can't really say it, but I don't know if I put him at the greatest center of all time, but he's definitely up there.
Yeah. Well, if you don't think that, you're wrong. Who's your best one?
My greatest center?
Yeah.
I go back and forth, honestly, between Wilt and Kareem. Those are the two I go back and forth with.
See, I'll tell you this. I think the greatest centers I ever saw were Olajuwon, Bill Walton before the knee injuries.
Oh, yeah.
And Arvydas Sabonis.
That's right. So Sabonis, Yeah, I know who that is. That's Domantas Sabonis' father. Yeah, I know. He's in the Hall of Fame. I remember him.
Yeah, he played for the Russian national team, and really he started having knee injuries about 84 or so, 85. He didn't get to play in the 84 Olympics because you had to boycott. But there he would have played against guys like Patrick Ewing. But I know in 1986, in the World Championships, even though he had bad knees, he scored like 30 points when the U.S. almost lost to the Russians, and he was holding his own and outplaying David Robinson at the time at center. And he could run a floor and pass. And see, that's the thing. I think guys like Walton and Sabonis, when they were healthy, were guys that could actually start your break. They could be in the middle of your break, and they could finish your break. And they all could shoot the ball. And if you just look at Walton, the one time he got healthy late in his career in 86 and how much he helped that Celtics team, that was probably what put him over the top that season. So, I mean, the greatest shot of all time, the most unstoppable shot of all time was Kareem's skyhook. But I also think this, when you watched Kareem play, especially once you get past 1975 or 76, he did have a tendency to take plays off. But I do think if you're going to tell me it's a big game and I get one center to win that big game, I'm probably going to take Kareem, because the game that stands out to me the most would have been 1985. He's 37 years old. They had just lost 148-114 in game one to the Boston Celtics at the Garden. And this is the year after they lost in 7 games to the Celtics in the Garden, where a lot of strange stuff happened. And it just seemed like they were cursed when they played the Celtics. And they come out for game 2 in 85. And I remember Brent Musburger starting to telecast that Kareem has a migraine headache. They don't know if Kareem's going to play. Kareem plays, and at 37 years old, ran the floor like he was 25. He ran Robert Parrish's ass into the ground. He scored 32 points, had like 17 rebounds, 7 block shots, basically put the team on his back, won them game 2. They won game 3 by a blowout. Game 4, I think the Celtics win at the buzzer on a Dennis Johnson shot. But then game 5 and 6, Kareem takes over again. And the thing that stood out to me is this is a 37-year-old man in the Boston Garden back in 1985. I think game 2 was on a Tuesday night. But you're playing in the Garden. There's no air conditioning. And, it's 90, 95 degrees in there. And this 37-year-old man is just outrunning everybody. I mean, they would start a fast break, and he'd be the one on the end dunking the ball. So when he wanted to be the best, there was no doubt he was. If you give me consistency, just every night, I know what I'm getting. Hakeem, because that little shake and bake fall away shot, that was probably the second most unguardable guy I've ever seen. And the sad thing for Olajuwon is a lot of people don't put him on that level because Michael Jordan didn't play in the finals the 2 years his team was in the finals. If you put Jordan there both times and Hakeem just wins one of those finals, then I think Hakeem would get that conversation more. And I really think this, 94-95, that Rockets team, I think would have beat the Bulls. I mean, because people forget Jordan played half a season before the 95 finals. They got wore out by Shaq and the Magic because they couldn't defend Shaq. And if they can't defend Shaq, they're definitely not defending Hakeem Olajuwon. And
Hakeem was basically an older, more wily version of Shaq, pretty much.
Yeah, and they did not. I don't think they didn't have Dennis Rodman in 95. So Dennis Rodman's the thing that put them over the top defensively in 96. But without Rodman in 94-95, I don't think they've got anybody, Luke Longley, Bill Winnington, whoever the hell it was back then. Those guys are not going to guard Hakeem Olajuwon. And I think the sad thing was Jordan bailed for a couple of years for whatever the reason is, which I don't think we know the truth about today, because it makes no sense to go play minor league baseball, especially when you're not very good. And I just think that's the thing that really hurt Olajuwon on that. But number one is Jim Brown as a running back.
Yeah, by far.
We ought to just do a general show. We can talk about anything.
Yeah. No, bring back to football. You're right. Jim Brown is number one. But I think with Kareem, I remember they were trying to kill Kareem off. The media was trying to, in the media and also other NBA players were like, Kareem's too old and stuff like that. They were trying to actively kind of bring him down. And Kareem basically said, look, I'm had enough of this. I'm not taking this anymore. And basically, for a little while, went back out there and just basically tore everyone else apart because he wanted to prove that he still had it. He did. He had it basically his entire career if he wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, he finished his career in 1989 in Game 40 NBA Finals. He wasn't playing great, but he was still better than your ordinary guy, and he was 40-some years old then. Have you seen the movie Airplane?
No.
Oh, my God. Really? Well, your
No.
homework is to watch Airplane tonight, and then we'll talk about it tomorrow. But in Airplane, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is actually in the movie. And he's like the co-pilot or something. And one of the kids starts talking about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or the pilot does or something. And the kid goes, "Don't talk about him because my dad said that he doesn't hustle up and down the floor all the time." And then Kareem goes, "You try guarding Bill Walton up and down the court every night, 82 nights out of the week." But it's funny. But all right, Sam, anything else we want to discuss before we go?
No, I think we got everything pretty much for now.
I think we go top 10 quarterbacks tomorrow. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm in for that. I'm down for it.
That way Anthony will come on the show because he'll want to talk.
Yeah, that way he'll pound for Roger Staubach and Troy Aikman. We'll get him on. We'll force him on.
Yeah. Well, actually, I like Roger Staubach and Troy Aikman, but they're both borderline top 10.
Yeah.
I think Aikman, like I said, he's won 3 Super Bowls. It's hard to argue with. But it would have been nice if he could have beat the Bengals on a 90-yard drive at the end of the game. It would have been nice because I've seen that done a few times. You want to tell everybody where they can find you, Sam?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Sam_Teets33. Constantly post new polls, articles, and stuff like that. So feel free to go check me out.
All right, and you can follow me at Grueling Truth on Twitter. You can also check us out on YouTube, where we are now up to over 50,000 subscribers, Sam. So once we figure out how to share this, we can get more live listeners or watchers.
Yeah,
but of course, we need to get Anthony to show up at 1 o'clock every day to do that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, make sure you follow us there. You can find us on iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, wherever you find sports podcasts, you'll find the Grueling Truth. So for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to the Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.